Greetings, music educators. This is Patrick Thames. I am a doctorate in music education candidate at Liberty University. And today we're going to talk about the inclusion of Charlie Parker into the composer ethos. This is to teach music educators to respect and honor his contributions to the history of music. Here's an introduction. We are going to talk about the rationale for the inclusion of composers, of all composers. Why include all composers and not only classical composers? First, it corresponds with national and state K-12 standards. This is according to Mark and Madura 2020 in their contemporary music education. It shows the continuity of music from its earliest beginnings to today. It instructs students on the cultural relevance and impact all people groups have had on music. Again, this is Mark and Madura, 2020. It opens the door for further inquiry and study into the development of music aesthetics and answers why we review music as beautiful. Here it is again, we're still going. It reveals and dispels the stereotype that classical music is legitimate and other forms of music are not. Last, it gives credit and acknowledges the achievements and contributions of all musical composers. Next slide. This is two forms of musical composition. Many times, students and music educators, they forget about the very first musical composition, which is spontaneous composition. And that is spontaneously composing music on the spot using improvisation and standard practice devices. Composers such as Bach, Handel, and Beethoven, they were famous and renowned for their ability to improvise melodies and chordal arrangements with rhythmic intensity. This is according to the Harvard Brief Dictionary of Music, April and Daniel, 1960. Recorded composition. I'm calling it recorded composition because you can record it by writing or recording the melodies, harmonies, and rhythmic ideals by using music notation on paper, computer, or audio recording device to archive those musical ideas for future generations. Here's another one. Classical musicians have become disconnected from spontaneous composition after the proliferation of sheet music with the onset of written cadenzas and solos. This is the reason why spontaneous composition is usually not included as a form of musical composition because we've gotten so used as music educators to have the whole music written out and performed as through composed pieces. Okay, jazz musicians revitalized the art of spontaneous composition or improvisation as a standard and expected composition practice. Again, this is April and Daniel in their Harvard Brief Dictionary of Music. So, as I'm communicating concerning composing music, I am, referring to the spontaneous composition and recording composition, writing or recording melodies, harmonies on paper or the audio recording device. Meet the composer. So I am focusing in today on Charlie Parker, and that's what we're talking about at this time. Who is Charlie Parker? Who is Charlie Parker? Charlie Parker was born in Kansas City, Kansas on August the 29th, 1920. Charlie Parker was a saxophonist and composer. He is considered to be one of the principal architects of bebop as a style of jazz. Some of the other architects of bebop are Dizzy Gillespie, Bud Powell, Thelonious Monk. All of those are considered major architects of bebop. The bebop compositional style is characterized by rapid improvisation, intense rhythmic ideals, and blues inflections. Parker, when he was writing, he wrote composition and then also uh, did spontaneous composition when he was performing. Some of his written compositions are O Privav, Blues for Alice, and Ornithology. Those are just a few of his compositions. Parker died at a very young age. He died in New York City, March 12, 1955, uh, when the physician that certified his death, he estimated his age as being early, uh, late 50s, early 60s, and Charlie Parker was only 34 years old. Very sad end to his life, tragic, but it is the truth. All right, here's a picture of Charlie Parker. I've seen a lot of pictures. This is one of his best pictures. Uh, Picture of Charlie Parker. Now, we're going to talk about some reasons why music educators exclude Charlie Parker. Uh, these music educators often emphasize certain facts about Charlie Parker. And we're going to talk about why music educators should not emphasize Parker's negative past, and music should be paramount in music education. This is what most music educators emphasize about Parker. They'll talk about his notorious drug and alcohol use, and many times, uh, many classical composers struggle with the same addictions, yet their music is deemed necessary. They talk about his hospitalization in the mental hospital after he experienced a mental collapse when he heard about the death of his daughter. And we probably can think of some other prominent classical composers that experienced the same mental struggles and illness. They want to talk about his irregular life struggles and inconsistencies. Many classical composers had extreme life struggles and inconsistencies, but their music is still deemed worthy of study. Why music educators should not emphasize Parker's negative past. Research suggests that sad stories could affect students' perception of the author's musical work. Now, this is Robert Foster, 2020. He wrote an article, cautioning music educators when they teach jazz history not to focus on the negative. Here's another point. If music educators continue to teach tragedy as their main emphasis, they will feel compelled to continually review the sordid details of that musician's failures and shortcomings to keep student engagement. And here's the last point on the slide. The music itself is the emphasis, not the negative. Now, I do want to say this. Sometimes their lives, reviewing the history may explain the reason why a composer composed a certain tune. Um, Example of Charlie Parker is his song. It was called "Relaxing at Camarillo" or Camarillo, and that song "Relaxing at Camarillo" was he felt good with his life and the place where he was uh, after getting treatment at that hospital, the mental hospital in California, Camarillo Mental Hospital. And so while he was there, he was inspired to write the song after getting the much needed rest that he got. So that's a case in point where sometimes you do need to mention uh, maybe something negative for a certain point to let them know that this song is a great song. and why. Okay, music for its worth should remain paramount in music education. You know, what I'm referring to is when we're talking about these composers, their lives are important, but let the music come first. Charlie Parker, he used cutting edge counterpoint and new compositional techniques in his spontaneous and written composition or recorded composition. Therefore, his music is worthy of study. Parker impacted every musician from his day until this time. His influence even influenced classical music. Thomas Owens, in his book Bebop, the Music and the Players, he talks about that on the first page of 28. Very good. If you don't have the book, get it. Parker's life mistakes and struggles should not diminish his worth as a composer. Music educators should examine his music for the genius it was and not judge the music by his failures, his personal failures. Let's go to the next slide. Now we're going to talk about specific compositional techniques that Parker used, and this is going to be in two parts. Here's the first part, his specific compositional techniques. Parker used contrafacts extensively. Now, if you haven't heard that word before, a contrafact is simply writing another piece of music based on the chord progression of an existing arrangement. An example is Charlie Parker's tune, Ornithology. This is a tune that was based on the jazz standard, How High the Moon, in that chord progression. Herman, in 2004, he investigated the solo in the recorded version of Ornithology, and he talks about the counterpoint that goes on, and he analyzed Charlie Parker's solo. Very interesting if you want to see that. Parker reharmonized existing tunes with chord and tritone substitutions, making the progression more interesting for the soloist, other musician, and the audience. Again, this is Herman, 2004. Parker's written compositions and improvisation consistently use ninths, 11ths, and 13ths. This technique was different from the earlier swing artists, who improvised using exclusively thirds, fifths, and sevenths. What that means when you're looking at each individual chord in a chord progression, uh, we know that we have the root, the third, the fifth, the seventh. Now, if you continue to stack it, it will go to the ninth and the 11th and the 13th. So Charlie Parker would take the ninth, 11th, and 13th and build his solos from that part of the chord. And he would string his improvisation based on that. Parker, this is the next point, Parker uses scalar descents, emphasizing guide tones or movement of thirds, fifths, and sevenths throughout his composition. Now, this is where you got to pay attention. Now, I already told you about the ninths, 11ths, and 13ths. But what he would do, he would take those ninths, 11ths, and 13ths, and he'll take the third of the ninth, the fifth of the ninth, or the seventh of the ninth of the substitutionary chords, and he would compose either by writing or by spontaneous improvisation. He would improvise or write a solo based on the movement of the ninths, 11ths, and 13ths, the third, fifth, and seventh of those chords. That may be confusing, but basically that's what Charlie Parker did. The higher intervals of the chord, he would take the third, fifth, and seventh of those chords. And it shows you what a genius Charlie Parker was to be able uh, to string together a coherent melody using that technique. And very impressive and fascinating how Charlie Parker was able to do that. All right, let's go to part two. Another specific compositional technique was rapid fire tempos and intense rhythmic syncopation and displacement. There's a story concerning Charlie Parker using his syncopation and displacement, that many musicians would get lost, including the drummer, because he would have it so intense and syncopated that many musicians would have a hard time finding out where is beat one. And Charlie Parker, being the genius that he was, knew exactly where he was. You should listen to the break from the famous A Night in Tunisia recording with Dizzy Gillespie. This is written in Owen's book. Again, Bebop, the Music and the Players. It's on page 42 and 43 if you would like to listen to it. For copyright reasons, I can't play it for you, but one of these days we will listen to it. All right, so Charlie Parker, another technique that he used. Now, this was important for his spontaneous compositions. He would quote classical and jazz throughout his spontaneous compositions. He would quote Habanera by Bizet. He would quote Country Gardens from Granger, and the Clarinet Obbligato from High Society. Again, this is Owen, and it's page 34 and 35. Parker's style is logical and consistent. His compositions and improvisations show the logic and thought. He knew exactly where he was going, where he wanted to go. When you look at his spontaneous improvisations and his written compositions on paper and you compare it with the chord progressions, it was very logical and very consistent. He was a virtuoso on the alto saxophone, and it was extremely logical and consistent. And many players, such as Sonny Stitt, who was another saxophonist, was able to 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 learn the language that Charlie Parker put forward because it was so logical and consistent. It was difficult, but it was logical and very consistent. All right, we're now at the conclusion. Music educators must be aware of Charlie Parker's impact and contribution to the field of music. It is no longer acceptable for music educators to only talk about the impact of the European composers. We must also be aware of American composers and their impact and contribution to the field of music. Music educators, here's the next point, should be able to teach the basic compositional techniques of Charlie Parker. Yes, it can get tricky and difficult, but we must be able to convey the basic compositional techniques of Charlie Parker and give that information to the students. Here's the next point. Music educators should use caution when recounting stories about composers, especially when they consider artists outside the mainstream. What I mean is mainstream, it is really a normal part of many music education programs to focus in on Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, Brahms, but maybe talking about Charlie Parker is considered outside the mainstream. But see, the importance of the music is paramount. The music and the worth of the music is important. And Charlie Parker is at the same level of a, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart or a Bach. Here's the last point. Music educators should be able to not only encourage written music composition, but also allow students to employ spontaneous composition. This is where studying Charlie Parker's spontaneous compositional technique and his written compositional techniques would help us to be able to understand what made Charlie Parker such a great improviser. Here is the bibliography, and these are some of the resources that I used for this PowerPoint presentation. I hope you have a good day wherever you are, and I've enjoyed my time presenting Charlie Parker, including him into the composer ethos.